Hi there, it's Sean McGeever, and I'm doing one of the Talk Tuesdays. I am going to do Luke 20. I know it's not even close to a Tuesday, but I've been working on this one really hard because it's a challenging chapter, Luke 20. And also, I'm doing the Club Talk on Monday. And so I've just been going back and forth about how I want to do this. So I'm going to give you my thoughts about how you might approach Luke 20. I'll be really upfront and honest. It's a really challenging one. It's one you probably have never, ever heard Club Talks on. And to be honest, if this is like your first Club Talk or whatever, I wouldn't recommend it. It's hard to see. It's not obvious at first. It just doesn't jump out at you how this fits in the gospel. But I'm going to try my best to paint a bit of a picture there. So I'm going to jump in. What is going on here is Luke 20 falls after an important event. So it's important to know where it fits in the storyline of Jesus' life, which is when you read in Luke 19, you see that in Luke 19, verse 20, it's the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So Luke 20 falls in between that little gap between when Jesus enters Jerusalem and when he is betrayed and crucified and resurrects. So it's in that final week. So there's a lot of tension. There's a lot building up. And so all these aspects I'm going to discuss here are at just the tipping point of tension between Jesus and the kind of existing religious authorities and even the government. And so there's just all sorts of tension here. So what's happening here, the key to what's happening here is actually you need to look back, not just starting in chapter 20, verse 1. Look back just a few verses earlier. What you'll see is at the end of chapter 19, Jesus had just cleared the temple and driven people out. And all of the existing religious leaders are really upset with him. And so Luke 20 is basically Jesus's response. All these people come to him frustrated and trying to trick him and trap him. And Luke 20 is kind of right in response to Jesus saying, I know more about what the temple's about and you don't deserve to be here. It's just kind of in the midst of this crazy situation. Right before he's going to be crucified, betrayed and crucified and all that. So anyway, really, in a lot of ways, this has a bunch of dynamics. It's a sin talk because it kind of shows how we are drawn to follow the wrong thing and how humans always let us down. But it's also an appropriation talk because Jesus is saying, there's a better way, and the way is me. And so I'll get into that in a minute. There's also a campaigners angle that I won't really go into, but basically we're so tempted to, even if we're following Jesus, to look elsewhere. So I'm going to talk about the way that I'm going to approach it. The kind of for the core part of my talk, the outline is going to have two parts. One is I want to introduce you to the haters. I know that sounds silly. And then I'm going to tell you a story. So when I say the haters, I want to introduce you to two groups of people that hated Jesus, that rejected his authority, were not happy with the claims that he was making. The first group is the religious leaders, and the second group is the government. The religious leaders, if you go through this entire chapter, it's the scribes, it's the priests, the chief priests, it's the elders, it's the Sadducees, and I'll talk in a moment about who all those people are. But just kind of in sum, every religious person in those days that had any authority were so upset with Jesus because he challenged their authority. In fact, in verse 2 of chapter 20, they said, "Who gave you this authority?" They don't think that he has the authority, and so they're frustrated with him. And so we learn in verse 19 that they sought to lay hands on him and that they were being insincere in verse 20. And so they're doing all sorts of things. So the religious leaders are really upset with him, and they really hate who he is and everything he stands for. The second part is the governmental leaders, or the government. And they really aren't an active player in the story, but when it gets to the story in verse 19, paying taxes to Caesar, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, the government was not happy with anyone else who claimed to be God because, as I'll mention in a moment here, even the coins themselves said, Caesar is God. There is no other. And so I'll talk about that. So there's two groups of people that really, really are upset at this point of Jesus' ministry, a couple days before he's going to die, and it's the religious leaders and the government. And then the second part is the story. And so I think what I'm going to do on Monday, in 2 days, is I'm going to highlight verse 9 through 18, which is the parable of the wicked tenants. And I'm not going to really go into nitty-gritty detail, but I'm just going to read it quickly and explain, look, Jesus told this story where someone who had given people land and sent people back to check and to instruct and to bring messages, they kept rejecting. And so finally the landowner said, I'm going to send my son, and they killed him. And this is right a couple days before Jesus is going to die. And so really this is a great talk to foreshadow the crosstalk, if maybe that's where you're at, because that's where Luke's at in telling the story of Jesus. But yeah, so that's basically my two parts there. I want to talk about the people who rejected Jesus, and then I'm going to talk about the story where Jesus is talking about the significance of what is about to happen here. So a couple main points. We can challenge people to think about, like, who is it that you follow? Who is your authority? Where is your allegiance? Who do you serve? It could be even someone great, like, oh man, I love my pastor and my family, or I'm really loyal to my government or my boyfriend or girlfriend or my coach or my teachers or myself. And it's not that those are inherently wrong. It's just that who is your ultimate and supreme authority? Who is it that you have ultimate allegiance to? And Jesus in that day was challenging those who were putting their faith and their trust and their allegiance, not in God, but in people, in the priests and the scribes and the elders and the Sadducees and the government. So that could be a main point. And basically it gets at Jesus will not settle for second. If you want to follow Jesus, don't put your trust in people. If we're to put our primary and exclusive trust in Jesus, because humans will always fail us. And really, that's kind of a sin talk right there. If we expect too much from any human, your Young Life leader, from me, from anyone, you're expecting too much. We are human, people who need God. God is the ultimate authority and the only one that we can fully trust. What does this show us about Jesus? Well, first off, Jesus knew fully that he would be misunderstood and perceived as a threat. Jesus knew that he was going to be killed. Jesus also knows when people are being sincere or insincere. It says that in verse 20. Also, Jesus knows when people are being crafty or shifty or trying to be tricky. We see that in verse 23. What does this show us about our lives? Well, we as humans stand in a long line of people who have rejected God's messengers. So getting back to the parable of the wicked tenants, when God's messengers and God's messages come into our life, by nature, we just want to reject that and say, no, we don't want to do that. And the story says that when they sent, the landowner's son, they killed him. And in fact, that's what they did with Jesus. And that's just kind of human nature. We love to reject authority, especially anyone who kind of demands things of us that we don't want, at least in our nature. And then the second one is that we might want to beware of religious officials and political leaders who flaunt their authority over us. In verse 46, it says, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at the feasts, who devour widows' houses for pretense of making long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation. And so anyway, not a major point, but we should beware of those who are trying to take advantage of any authority in our lives. A couple technical details. All this is happening pretty much in the temple, and the temple is the center of all of Jewish worship, believed actually to be the dwelling place of God's presence on earth. And then there's a whole bunch of different people. You don't necessarily need to know or explain all these people. I have a list of who they are in my sheet, but the chief priests, these are people who carried out roles in the temple. They're the scribes. This literally is people who were writers. That's what the Greek word means. The people who copied things down, and so because of this, we were very knowledgeable in religious rules. They're also kind of like lawyers and experts in the law. Whenever you see that phrase, that's what that means. They're the elders. We don't know exactly who that is, but it's just a broad phrase or broad word for those who were experienced and that the community trusted. Then there's also the Sadducees at the end, and really the main thing that we know about them, they differed from a lot of the religious teachers because they didn't believe in the resurrection. One last thing, and this is kind of interesting, is when it talks about paying taxes to Caesar, this could be something that you highlight here. And it's good to know a little bit about the denarius, the coin that they used there. And so a denarius was one day's wage. It's what you get for one day. And so it wasn't a small amount, but also wasn't a major amount of money. But more importantly, it's what was on that coin. So that coin in Jesus' day was almost certainly, I have it written down here, it had an image of Tiberius Caesar. And it said on this coin, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. I have a little link in my handout where you can like look this up online, and it shows you a picture of it. But the irony is really difficult. I mean, think about what it says there. It says, son of this person, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, son of the divine emperor's name. So it's saying the son of God is an emperor, and his son's name is Tiberius. I mean, clearly, kind of Luke's emphasis, and actually one of the phrases that that Luke uses for Jesus is the Son of God. And so implicit in the story here, it might not jump out at you here, but what's going on there is when the government or the people who, even the religious leaders in this sense, are saying, yes, we are going to kind of fit the mold and go with this inscription, which says that the government is the God, and that his son is the Son of God. That's basically contradictory to the entire gospel and the nature of who Jesus is and who he proclaims himself to be. And the irony is super thick, because it is the religious leaders themselves who pull out a coin, who have this coin on them. And so their idolatry isn't just in their head or in their hearts, it's actually literally in their pockets, because they are complicit with acknowledging that the government and the government rulers are claiming to be the Son of God, and they are complicit with that. And so, yeah, that's just intense and a little bit packed in there. So anyway, that's it. A couple analogy or illustrations, and I'll wrap it up. And I'll just, once again, I'll say this is kind of a tricky passage. One illustration you could have is just a coin. If you saw the link that I have in there, you could pull up a picture of the coin. But, coins aren't inherently bad. It's not bad to, belong to a country and to trade in coins. But when the coin demands of you to acknowledge your rulers as God, then that is clearly something that Jesus is saying, I want you to rethink where your full allegiance is. In fact, a lot of coins, whether or not people know it, or dollar bills and stuff like that, say, in God we trust in America. Whether or not people really believe that or act on that, or what the original meaning was behind why they put that on there, who knows? But you could have a coin and just say, what does this mean? What does it mean that we have symbols and things like this? And what if it said, what if our government required us to acknowledge the governmental leaders to be God, for us to call them God and to treat them as such? And then the last illustration, and this one might be a little controversial, but it could be, I think I might do this in the beginning of my talk, which is acknowledging people and groups who are willing to challenge the existing authorities. And this is a very real thing going on, at least in when I'm making this video and in our community, because yesterday was the day when, at least at the schools in my area, and probably in many in your area, was the March for Our Lives, when they walked out. And so right now there's just a lot of people who are challenging the authorities. And no matter what you think about that, you think that's good or bad, it is happening. Whether it's the March for Our Lives, or also going on across the country, but also here in Arizona, fair pay for teachers, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a bunch of people who are saying, I want to challenge what's going on, the existing status quo. And so this is something that people are willing to do and have opinions about on both sides. And so that isn't really the purpose. I don't want to, that's not the purpose of my introduction or my illustration. It's just that if we are willing to consider challenging authorities, what about eternity? What about our thoughts and our decisions and our motivations to think about what about eternity? Jesus challenges us to think about our eternal authority. And so if we're willing to, and rightly so, at least in my opinion, to have think deeper and think more about the existing kind of status quo in our current society, what about the eternal commitments that we have? And so Jesus was willing in Luke chapter 20 to shake up, and he knew he was actually going to go to his death a couple days later, and yet he knew that it was worth it. Anyway, complicated. I'm going to do my best to explain this to my club. I care a lot about them. I'm going to be praying a lot because I'm going to need it. But this is part of the way that Luke said, I want people to know the gospel. This is part of the way that Jesus lived his life. And I'm just going to be faithful to do the best I can to explain it and trust that the Holy Spirit's going to proclaim the gospel in the midst of it. So I hope you have a great time with your club talks. And the following week will be the cross talk. I can't wait for that. And blessings on all of you. Talk to you later. Bye.